Agent integration skills are really important right now for you to master. They're going to become a commonplace skill in the future, just like someone using Excel or Google spreadsheets. There's going to be a massive focus on integration. So you are going to have to understand how to implement these agents within an existing ecosystem. So for projects that you're working on, the agents are going to need to either collaborate, and being the person in the middle, you're going to have a solid understanding of what are the known limitations of that agent. And this makes forces you into a different position, right? You're going to have to think about the end-to-end product development, not just the one narrow task, but how does it fit within the whole scope of the story that you're developing. And as agents become more prevalent, the speed to ship these things to production is going to get faster. And I think that story of how do we get agents into production will kind of go away in the next couple of years, just because the known patterns are coming out. You're going to be able to study them. You're going to be able to see them within different products. It's going to be very easy to start shipping these to production. Now is the perfect time to get started in terms of ramping up on your knowledge around AI agents. When it comes to complex projects that's going to involve multiple agents or even one agent that needs to do a complex task, being able to manage that agent is going to be the key difference between you and someone else who doesn't know how to do that task. As you're working with AI agents in your project right now, it could be really tempting to think that you don't have to debug it. It should just do everything for you, right? We're not there yet. It's going to be a process. It is better for you to think about the agent as a solid first draft or a solid second draft at whatever task you're doing. You're going to want to debug the process, make the updates necessary to push up the success rate. Now, success rates for agents, I think across the board, have been sub 50%. This is like a general rule of thumb for these agents. Now, increasing that success rate for agents at whatever task they're doing comes down to how much context you're able to give them. Think about this from a very simple perspective, like self-driving cars. When you call a self-driving car, its job is to take you from point A to point B. You put that into some app, you give it the instructions, it drives up to you, it takes you from point A to point B. Now, there's a lot of engineering effort that went into building that self-driving car beforehand so it could execute that task for you. Also, when it's going from point A to point B, it does have some autonomy on how it can accomplish it, but it still has to take you from point A to point B. If it doesn't do that, then what is the point of having that self-driving car if it takes you to some random location? And that's going to be the same thing with agents here, but at a smaller scale. You're going to have to think about the inputs and the outputs, but let the agent actually decide how to get from the input to output. And also, you're going to have to understand the amount of work that goes up front to design that agent to make sure when it comes time for it to actually execute that task, it does it well. Now, there are a ton of frameworks right now that you can use combined with like your domain expertise to craft agents, to set up agents maybe for you, for your clients, a workflow you have. And I did one of these myself. So I did like a little experiment to say, okay, let's try to build a really narrow scope down agent, and you can follow along with me here. I have a couple of requirements that I gave myself. One is it needs to set up a Python fast API, and it just needs to prototype it. I don't want something that's going to go to production just yet. It doesn't need to be on AWS. I'm going to use Modal in the backend. Also, I want it to generate a project structure for me. I'm going to give it some instructions, but I want to see how well it follows those instructions. And then it should have a README. There should be a README in there that gives me instructions. If I come back in like 2 or 3 months, I understand what the project did and I can kind of work with it some more. And it also has to give me the ability to deploy a serverless endpoint. I don't want to have to manage servers. I don't want to have to manage infrastructure for this. This endpoint should be completely serverless at the end of the day. All right, so let's jump into that repo. I'm going to walk you through step by step how to get started with it. And then we can see how well it performs at the actual task that I wanted it to do here. So I have cloned the repo locally, and I'm in my favorite editor, Cursor, right now. And if you open this up in Cursor or any VS Code compatible editor, you should see something that pops up and says reopen in container. You could also just open it manually in the container yourself by clicking this logo at the bottom left-hand corner and then hitting reopen in container. That should use the same definition I've already provided and give you a working container, so you don't have to do any of the Python installations or any Docker installations or any Node installations, besides the Docker that's already on your desktop. I included a README. You can basically just follow this README step by step here. And the first thing you're going to want to do is Poetry install, because there are a couple of Python libraries that need to be installed locally here. All right, so I've already installed them. That's why it went pretty quick. Then you're going to do Poetry Shell, and that's going to start up a virtual environment with those dependencies included. The next step is going to be a couple of things we need to provide to the underlying AI framework being used here called Control Flow. It's expecting us to use OpenAI. So what you're going to want to do is change the default model that's being used over to Claude 3.5. I found that it's just better for coding tasks. And then you're going to want to also export your Anthropic API key. So I'm going to grab my API key and put this in here in a bit. Now that is done, you can go ahead and simply run the agent. What we have here is a simple agent. It's just basically giving us a prompt. It's going to build that API for us, but it needs a little bit more information. I actually prepared a prompt ahead of time just to make this go a little bit quicker. And the idea is we want to have an endpoint where I can send in a URL and basically get a critique of that URL's landing page copy. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that prompt in. You can review that later. It's sitting within the repo. So we're going to let this work. I'll come back once it is finished, and then we can review the output, and then you'll be able to see how it's working, if it worked or not, and we'll test out landing pages. The agent is done. It's given us a lot of output in terms of logs on what it's done. It has some tool calls that it's used here. It's also gone ahead and done some of the coding for us, so you'll see some code. And then it wrote all the files out to the current directory. It even failed on one of the tasks, and it recovered from that to finally finish up here. So let's actually review what it built out. It created this service copywriting critique API. We got a main file, we got a pyproject.toml, and then we also get a readme. So I'm going to open up the readme. Okay, it's not bad. And I think it gives enough instructions on what I would expect from the instructions. So what I'm going to do is actually go ahead and test out this API. So I'm going to go install this on the local desktop. Let me exit from this shell environment. Then I'm going to cd into the service itself and then run that quick poetry install. We'll see if we run into any issues here. This is probably where you would run into issues most likely with these models, is they often don't have the dependency logic down. So you'll see here we have no versions of Fast API match, right? Just some issues with the Fast API version. Let's take a look at the pyproject.toml. This is what I was talking about earlier. You're going to have to do a little bit of debugging in terms of what you're trying to use here. So it seems like Fast API is the problem, but this seems like the most recent version of Fast API. So let's check what is the most recent version of Fast API here, and I'll come back and update this. All right, so I was able to fix the issue. It literally just had the wrong version of Fast API, so I went searched up what the latest version of Fast API was, getting that in there. All right, so here is the moment of truth. Let's actually just deploy this and see what we get. We see, it seems like we have an issue. It's looking for a modal is not defined. Okay, so some installation issues here. Let me go into the file. Let's check that out. We have modal app saying modal not defined. It might be this here. I don't think that's a needed piece of code. Oh, I see the problem. So it's trying to read this secret. I think that might be an issue with one of my instructions. So it doesn't need that. It just needs a secret from modal. All right, now let's try to deploy it. So even with the AI writing a lot, even with the agent writing a lot of this code, I still had to go in and debug and fix a couple of things. So that's usually the workflow I've seen with some of these, where yeah, it works maybe on the first try, but you have to debug a couple of things sometimes. Okay, so let's deploy main. Now we're getting a deprecation error. Singular secret parameter is deprecated. Okay, that's on me. I think I didn't pass in this as list. Okay, and so I just need to change that to secrets. Okay, so let's clear that and let's deploy it. So I'm just gonna take it's looking for the name app in here, so it's written modal.app, which is the problem. Modal deploy main. Cannot find secret OpenAI API key. So this is because I don't have my API key set up in modal, described as this keyword here. I think I have it in all caps, so I need to update that script as well. So let's do this. OpenAI API key. All right. There we go. Now it is running. A couple of bug fixes here, but I think that's all right. It's just secrets management. I had a couple typos, but overall, in a span of a few minutes, I was able to set up this API endpoint pretty quickly. Now let's actually test it out. I'm going to install something called Thunder Client. So Thunder Client just makes it easier to test out APIs really quickly. We want to give it the URL of any website. So I've been using something called Linear, which really helps with speeding up software development. This is for more complex projects. Obviously, I didn't put this project in here, but it really helps with keeping track of what you're doing and also giving you a good visual overview of where your project is and where it's going. And let's see how well the agent likes Linear's landing page. So I haven't actually looked at the logic of the code. And so hopefully this works, but I should have took a look at the logic of the code first. So we're going to see if this works or not. Okay, we got a 200 on this. That's not bad. Okay. So overall, the copy and landing page does a thorough job of outlining the product's purpose, its functionalities, and how beneficial for different types of security. Yeah. So we got some good feedback here. Some actions for the Linear team. I'm sure you guys don't need my advice on how to write landing page copy. So what we went through here is a pretty quick process where I asked the agent to set up an API for me. It set up the scaffolding of the API, but it took my knowledge around how Modal works to really figure out what the issues were and highlight what the issues were. So I've been using Modal for a while. I could quickly find the errors and fix them, but I could see someone who's not used to Modal not being able to fix this code, even with the AI getting prompted over and over again. But overall, I would rate this a pretty good job. It wasn't a very complex task. Let's take a look at the setup that I did for this. The actual framework being used here is something called Control Flow. So Control Flow is from the team that created Prefect, and it's really good in terms of, I like that it's a lightweight library, and it works on 3 primitives, right? Task, agents, and a flow. They should have flow right here. But the way this works is you define a flow, and then you can define different tasks within that flow and assign agents to the task. So it's very task-centric, but the agent definition also makes it really easy to structure your agents and move them around within different flows. So you'll see here as an example that, let's go to the docs here. So here's the flow. You're just rolling some dice. And then assigning the agents to a flow is pretty easy. There's just a parameter you have to describe, and then you can assign the agents like this. So the agents are also described in a way that's very familiar. If you've been using something like Crew AI or LangChain or Llama Index, this should not feel that much different. You can give each agent its own specific instructions. So the way I use this, and I really just nicked this from their examples, is I created one agent and I had 3 tasks. So there's just one agent here, which is responsible for doing all the programming, and it has access to a couple tools. One is the file system, Python, and the shell. It actually didn't do much shell commands, which is a good thing. And then I have this base class built with Pydantic that's called a design doc. So the agent's first task is to actually complete a design doc for the given user input. That way it can really steer itself during the coding process. Second is that it's going to make its own directory for all the work that it's doing. That's just to keep it organized, and so it doesn't go off the rails editing too many files. It has one workspace, similar to how you start your projects, right? You have one workspace to do it in. And then the actual API itself. So the task isn't do this, do that, do this. It's more, hey, just finish the API. And giving it that directive to finish the API, it'll then put itself into a loop where it'll continue to try to code out the API. So the real nice thing I like about this is you can provide the agent with a top level line of instructions. And so that top level line of instructions here, I found that being specific in terms of how you would tell maybe like a junior engineer or another engineer on your team how to do this if they weren't familiar with Python, didn't know Modal, this is how you do this. And just giving it that explicit instruction really helps with the output of the code later, so it can adapt itself to any type of scenario. In this setup here, you'll see it looks like a very regular README. I tell the agent about the folder structure. I gave it some examples of code that would be written in Modal, and you can see why I got confused on the signature for the app in Modal, because I actually provided it here in my example. So that's something I might update before I release this. And then I gave it how to read secrets, how to start secrets. So that's why I wasn't able to get the OpenAI secret. I would have to put in my instructions, hey, if you have any secrets, make sure you appropriately rename them inside of your API before moving forward. And then I gave it an example of a PyProject TOML files. Now that I know it can't really catch which fast API version to take, I'm going to update this to just have the fast API version I want it to use, because it'll be able to then perfectly pull that in. All right, and then some other instructions I gave it were like more vague, but project title, description, installation instructions, how to run modal, it did do that for us. And then a process overview. So these are the steps that it should follow given those little code snippets above. And that was it overall. I really didn't spend much time developing this. I just really put this together on a weekend after reading through the control flow docs. But this process could be repeated for any framework, I think. So you could use something like LangChain agents. You could use CrewAI, AutoGen. It really doesn't matter. The point is you want to be able to give the agents enough context to do the work for code generation. So let's actually make a couple of those updates and let's see how it performs on the second go round. So I'm going to go into instructions. I'm going to update the examples here to make sure it works with the modal version that we want. All right, so the first problem was FastAPI wasn't working. So let's get the FastAPI version from here. So I'm going to grab FastAPI from here, the instructions. And then I also want to make sure that when we start the app, it's just app. So I'm going to remove that modal piece right there. I'm going to take that out as well. And that should fix the issue where it's getting confused on the naming of the actual app it needs to deploy to production. All right, so with those two changes, that should pretty much solve it. I'm actually going to delete this here and then rerun the entire experiment. Let's do that. I have to exit out of Poetry, CD up, and then we're going to run the agent again. And notice that when you exit out of the Poetry virtual environment, you're likely going to clear out the API keys. So you're going to need to reset that as well. I'm going to go here. I'm going to just copy that. And then I'm going to get my API key again. All right, now that I've set my API key, I'm going to run the agent one more time. Oh, I haven't started my virtual environment, so let me do that. Okay. I'm going to grab my prompt while it's loading up. Then I'm going to go ahead and paste in the prompt that I have come up with. We're going to let it work, and we're going to come back and see if this time it performed better with those little minor corrections that we've made. All right, so we have a new version of this up from the API agent, and it seems like it did a little bit better. It caught that I just want app here and not modal-app, and it also set up the ASCII function correctly, but it's still giving me this weird if name equals main modal.runner deploy stub. I think that's from old documentation of modal, so that might be inside of the training model of GPT-4o, so we're going to get rid of that. And then it also is lowercasing all of the secret keys, so it got correctly how to reference the secret, but I still need to update this to OpenAI API key. So regardless, even if the agent was able to do a lot of the work, there were still small edits in the end that I have to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. I already started the virtual environment, so we don't have to do that again. And let's just deploy this out. All right. So we have the endpoint up and running, and I'm going to test this with Thunder Client again. So we're going to do linear again, and we're just going to go ahead and send off that request. So we get back. Detail not found. I think it's because I have this comma at the end here. Field value error missing, query in URL. So let's go back to the main file and see where it has messed up. So I found the mistake here that it made. One, it tried to, when it wrote this function, it only had the URL string here, where when I'm trying to process the request, you need this to be within a body. So making that simple change, the body like this, and just making sure we're processing a dictionary, then having that URL get passed as a request, everything worked just fine. And I was able to redeploy it, make it work. Overall, this still stands as a good way to just outline a quick stub of an API that I may want to use. Like I mentioned before, you're going to have to get really good at managing debugging and working with these agents to build out workflows. Now, this could be much more complicated, right? I could have this doing infrastructure templates for me, and then that level of debugging would be a lot different. So there's a lot more work to be done here to make sure this is more reliable, but I think it's a solid start in terms of, yeah, I often forget how to do this. Having something that's well documented, I can go ahead and make a little update here and there, and then make an update to the actual deployment of it works pretty well for me. And overall, I'm going to start using this pattern a lot more. This pattern where I define a lot up front, put it in some documentation, have an agent look at it, and then stub out a lot of files for me. I think next up would be trying something on your own and looking at what are some things you do all the time in code, or even maybe something that you do that's not code related, but you think you can use this agent for. You can go ahead and grab this and give it a try. Let me know how that goes. If it completely fails, if it completely works, or if it's in the middle and you've made some updates yourselves.